Hey everybody, welcome to week 4 of jazz history at Portland State University. Hope you're enjoying the class so far. Sorry about some of the glitches with the quiz. I think we've gotten that straightened out. Maybe it had something to do with Mercury in retrograde or something. So this week, the gist of the PowerPoint at the very least is the Great American Songbook. And it isn't covered as often in jazz history books or courses. Sometimes I think it's sort of taken for granted, and maybe because the people that are considered Tin Pan Alley songwriters are not jazz musicians per se. So I think oftentimes we forget that many of the great jazz performances, the compositional material is from people like Cole Porter and George Gershwin and Jerome Kern and people like that. So, and that also includes some people who did end up being jazz musicians. Duke Ellington is in some ways a Tin Pan Alley composer. And I think that just gets into what is Tin Pan Alley. Tin Pan Alley was an actual place, as you will read in your PowerPoint, but it's really kind of a hypothetical construct. It's what people refer to. It's really the music business in the United States between 1920 and 1950. Some people say that rock and roll was really the end of the Tin Pan Alley business, but it was popular music, and we included in a jazz course because jazz musicians took that pop music and made it their own. When you look at the music that Louis Armstrong made into jazz, or I hate to say made into jazz, but sort of we think of jazz as a genre, but in a way it's really an approach to any kind of music. So that's why that's one of the confusing things about jazz, or just the word jazz, is because jazz musicians sort of absorb anything they play. You can do jazz versions of any kind of music, and I suppose you could say it becomes jazz then. It's a jazz performance, but if you take classical music and rearrange it to your own purposes, then I think that's different. But what's key about the Tin Pan Alley era, we can say Tin Pan Alley and refer to a certain body of music, but it was also really an era, and I think the height of that was 1920 to 1950, although some people say it really began in 1885. Just in terms of the industry, it was really centered in Manhattan, as a lot of things were at the time. So you had what was called song pluggers, pianists who promoted these songs that the publishing houses had ownership of and were trying to sell. They just sat in one of these brownstones on West 28th Street and between 5th and 6th Avenue, and just played these songs, and somebody might walk in and say, hey, let me buy some sheet music, or hey, I want to use this song for something, or I have an artist that might want to perform this song, that sort of thing. So, and just to remember, before radio, the way that we knew a song was successful was by the sale of sheet music. And many people had pianos in their homes. This is before radio, before television, before the internet, of course. So a piano was the home entertainment for at least the middle class. And one cool thing in the PowerPoint, you may have seen this cartoon before. It's called One Froggy Evening, and it features a character who we now know is named Michigan J. Frog. And this was a cartoon I really loved as a kid. But what's interesting about it is that all of the songs, except for one, the Michigan Rag, which was written for the cartoon, all of these songs are considered Tin Pan Alley songs, and some of them are very old. There's one that the frog sings. As you'll see, it's basically involves a singing frog, but it's a very clever cartoon. But he sings many songs, and one of the songs, "Come Back to Erin," is actually from 1866. So it's in some ways it's a history lesson. "Hello, My Baby" is one of the very much featured songs in the cartoon, and I mentioned in the PowerPoint that it was actually what is known as a coon song. Now, a coon is considered a very offensive term for African Americans. So some of you may find this offensive, but I think in terms of history, I mean, it's just like studying the Civil War or slavery or the Civil Rights Movement. It's in some ways hard to believe that some of these customs and terrible institutionalized racism and these offensive things were really a part of everyday life. So I only present this for historical purposes. I mentioned in the PowerPoint that you can actually listen to some other coon songs if you go on YouTube, and it's I would understand if you wouldn't want to listen to that, because it's kind of offensive, and also some of the music is pretty pointless. But it was a very popular fad from 1880 to 1920, and so some publishers were just adding these coon song elements to their songs to try to make them more popular. So I suppose some things never change. There is that commercial element. And so in a way that's different, because a lot of jazz we tend to think of as being very much art music. But there is sort of this, there is a paradox, I guess, between things that are written for artistic purposes or people that we consider to be great artists, but then also the fact that this was an industry and people wanted to make money. So it's sort of sad that they had to resort to these kind of things. But again, when they say, "Oh, well, that was the time," it's hard to believe. So anyway, I have the same rundown in the PowerPoint, sort of top 10 Tin Pan Alley composers. Obviously, there are many, many more. I talk a little bit about Stephen Foster, who we've already seen in earlier PowerPoints. And so one of the things about this PowerPoint is what I wanted to demonstrate with some of the YouTube examples is how we have original versions of tunes, and then we have different versions of tunes. And one issue came up when I taught the class live. Somebody wanted to say that, well, the question was, if another artist does a song that was written by someone else or performed by someone else, isn't that considered just a cover? And I say absolutely not, because it is the expectation, if not the duty, of a jazz musician to make the song their own. So I think that this is a very good example here. We have the St. Louis Blues with its original version by the W.C. Handy Orchestra, and then I include a performance by Herbie Hancock and Stevie Wonder, and it's almost unrecognizable. And this is what jazz musicians do. We take material and we change it, and we make it our own, and we improvise, and we phrase it differently, and that's really the whole point. And we're expected to do it differently every time. So now, I mean, you could have an arrangement, but just in general, the expectation is that we're we take material, and that's, I think, why the Tin Pan Alley era music is still very popular with jazz musicians, because it's very malleable. Again, when we take a song, and I have examples of this, Cole Porter's "What Is This Thing Called Love?" When you look at the melody, it's a very simple melody, very well crafted, but very simple. So we can do different things with the phrasing. That's why I think a lot of today's popular music, I mean, and you could say even just popular music after the Tin Pan Alley era, is hard to make into jazz, or to manipulate in a jazzy way, because it's so specific. The rhythms and the notes are so specific that if you alter it, it becomes unrecognizable. But obviously there's many exceptions, and jazz musicians are now looking at newer music to have something to be more relevant to them and so forth. Because again, some of the Tin Pan Alley tunes that jazz musicians play are very old, in almost getting to the point of being 100 years old. So, so take a tune like "What Is This Thing Called Love," which again is in your PowerPoint, but just the melody. So if I were to play the song, I would not play it that straight. I would definitely manipulate it, as we hear with the great singers, the great jazz instrumentalists. They, for lack of a better term, they jazz it up. So I would play it something like... So, and that's not real, that's just the beginning, you know. That's just a kind of a light treatment of it. But, so that's, you know, and I could go on all day with examples of that with, you know, I have whole lists of tunes here, and you can research those yourself if you want. Speaking of George Gershwin, who's in your PowerPoint, I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but just to talk a little bit about some of the things you'll be looking at. It's kind of the same thing. There'll be more what I call straight versions of these songs, because again, these were not conceived, the Tin Pan Alley repertoire was not conceived for jazz musicians. It was conceived for Broadway, for movies, for torch singers. In the case of Body and Soul, written by Johnny Green, Johnny Green, I'm sure, never could have predicted the Coleman Hawkins version of this song, where he basically, instead of actually really dealing with the melody, he just goes off on the changes. And I guess that's really when jazz became modern, is it became very abstract. So that's something to check out, of course. And I also talk a bit about Fats Waller, although we don't necessarily, for some reason, I think he should be considered in the Great American Songbook, which is, those terms are interchangeable, Tin Pan Alley, Great American Songbook. But Fats Waller wrote 600 tunes, and we know jazz musicians play many of them, and his music is still very popular. He was very popular at the time. I believe he died at 39. So in this book, History of Jazz by Ted Joye talks about how, you know, Fats Waller probably would have been great for television because he was such a great entertainer, but also a musician at the highest level. So one thing, maybe I did not put it in here, but to know, oh yes, so some of these songs, well, yeah, a great many of these songs, jazz musicians tend to do what we would call the chorus. Now, song form, pop song form has changed a lot. In today's music, we tend to have verse, chorus, maybe bridge, chorus, that type of thing. Well, this is not exactly that. This is more like in the Tin Pan Alley era, you had forms which were more like, if you know anything about opera, recitative and aria. So aria in an opera is the tune that everyone knows, and then the recitative is the part, because opera is all sung as a melody, but let's say some parts of it are more melodic than others. There's sort of the talking part that sounds almost more like talking. So that's what they call recitative. And so in American song form of the Tin Pan Alley era, they have the verse and they have the chorus. Now when you listen to Body and Soul, some of these earlier versions, the version, let's see here, sung by Libby Holman, it's a very straight version, which is from 1930. She sings what's called the verse, and then the chorus. So the chorus is the part of the song that we tend to know these days. Performing the verse has become a lost art form. You really only hear singers do it occasionally, and instrumentalists not very often, unless the musician is from an older generation or maybe just hipper than most. So, but you'll hear Body and Soul. You know, the part of the tune that we know is my heart is sad and lonely, for you I sigh, for you dear only. So that's the part that we know, but there's also another part which sort of sets the stage for the story of the chorus. It's almost like a warm-up or an introduction that sort of gets you ready. And some of the verses of these songs are as beautiful as the body of the tune. So so you'll check that out in your PowerPoint. I wanted to give as an example a song that a lot of jazz musicians do called "But Not For Me," and we usually hear the part. This is a George Gershwin song. They do. Let's see here. They're writing songs of love, but not for me. Lucky stars above, but not for me. So that's the body of the tune, but the verse sort of sets it up in a very, these lyrics, I mean, often maybe there's a reason that the verse falls out of favor, because you try to figure out what he's talking about in the lyrics, and maybe it's almost like, it sounds very dated or something, but I don't know. I think that the melody of this verse, "For Not For Me," is interesting. So let's try it. Old man sunshine, listen you, never tell me dreams come true, just try it, and I'll start a riot. Beatrice Fairfax, don't you dare ever tell me she will care, I'm certain it's the final curtain. I never want to hear from any cheerful Pollyanna who tell you fate supplies a mate. It's all bananas. They're writing songs of love, but not for me. A lucky stars above, but not for me. I found more clouds of gray than any Russian play can guarantee. I was a fool to forget that way. I hope it lasts and also like a day. Although I can't dismiss the memory of her kiss, I guess she's not for me. Although I can't dismiss the memory of her kiss, I guess she's not for me. I guess she's not for me. Anyway, so it's just interesting to hear the verse and the chorus together, and like I said, it's definitely worth mentioning in this unit. So. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the PowerPoint and the film, and same stuff as before. There will be a midterm week 5, and we'll have some sort of review for that online, but keep your questions coming. As of last count, there are 205 people in this class, so I do attempt to answer all of your emails, but usually what seems to be happening, like with some of these glitches and stuff, is that I just fix it and I send out a mass email. So, okay, good luck. Thank you.